Well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be together with you here, and it's nice to see so many people here this morning. I did a little bit of a check through the list yesterday as we did the campsite allocations, and I noticed that there are still plenty from Vista that I have not booked into Big Camp. That's starting this week. I trust that means that you're going to be commuting during this coming week. Of course, it starts this Tuesday up at Tanunda, and we are really looking forward to camp. We have a number of presenters. Of course, one of our main presenters is Pastor Pavel Goya, and we're really privileged to have Pavel come. I had the privilege and opportunity to hear Pavel a number of years ago, and I really wanted to see if there was any chance of him coming to South Australia. And when I actually made contact with him, he said to me, I receive 10 to 15 speaking requests a day. So the fact that he's able to have made this time available for us, I believe, is a real answer to prayer and a real privilege to be able to have him come. Of course, one of our presenters arrived yesterday, the day before yesterday, and with a little bit of misunderstanding with our courier. We almost lost him there for a few hours, but we found him again. That's, of course, our mission president, Pastor Luther Tanavecki, our sister mission president, I should say, Luther Tanavecki from Kiribati. And so he's going to spend not only camp with us, but he's going to stay on for a few extra days. And so that will be really, really good. It's really good for us to sort of think beyond just our borders, beyond our state, beyond our needs, and interact. Of course, Kiribati is quite a remote place, and it'll be interesting to hear a little bit more from Luther over the next little while, to work with him and trust that we can be of benefit to him. So yes, I just want to commend to you, remind you about camp, and of course you will be praying that tomorrow morning, between 10 and so forth, I guess, Stephen, the rain will at least pause for then, so that we can set up at least in reasonable conditions. Then it can rain again, because we haven't had it for a long time. Those of you who were there greeting me this morning would have seen me come in looking a bit like a drenched rat, because for the 5 minutes that it's actually rained all year in Adelaide was the 5 minutes that I took to get out of the car to walk into the church. And once I got in and was soaked, 5 minutes later I looked outside and the sun was blazing. And I said to Alison, it's mocking me now. But I've dried off, so it's all good now. I've brought a couple of soft drink bottles along with me this morning to start off with. I want you to listen very carefully. Did you all hear that? Do you know what that's called? The other day, when I was telling someone what I was going to speak about, they called it effervescence. Is that right? I remember when there was the Schweppeffervescence. I used to promote it. Now let's listen to this one. What was the difference? No Fizz. What's happened to this one? What happens when a soft drink loses its fizz, huh? Goes flat. What's it like? What's it taste like? Not very attractive? Sugary water. Now, some people possibly prefer sugary water, but generally we know that when a soft drink loses its fizz, it's pretty much lost what it's meant to be. Its main thing. It becomes flat. It becomes not really what it's intended to be. You know, there's a danger for us to lose our fizz as Christians. It's actually a natural tendency over time to start to lose our fizz, isn't it? Think about it. You know, things come in life, discouragement, some setback, some difficult experience comes along our way, and it just leads us to sort of get discouraged and to begin to lose our Christian fizz. That initial zeal, or as it's one place called the first love that we had when we first became Christians, when we fell in love with the Lord and when we were strong for Him. And it's a natural tendency that happens over time. Or if we're just coming into church week in, week out, going through the motions, tendency is for our fizz to wane. What about for organisations? The same thing can also happen. There is a book called Mission Drift, and this person looks at a number of organisations, and he makes this very interesting statement. He says, without careful attention, faith-based organisations, that's us. That's us. He said, without careful attention, faith-based organisations will inevitably drift from their founding mission. What about us as an organisation? What about us as a church? Well, asking ourselves the question, why do we exist? Are we important? Are we even necessary? Where do we fit in? What is our purpose? Or are we just another denomination that happens to worship on a different day and have a few odd dietary habits? I want to suggest to us that when we lose our distinctive mission and our message, we've essentially lost our fizz. Let's begin by looking at something that Jesus said. I want you to open your Bibles to the Gospel of John, John chapter 14. So John chapter 14. We're going to read a statement that Jesus made. John chapter 14. And verse 6. Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, what I want us to see here is that Jesus was not being politically correct. Jesus didn't just suggest that there is a way or that there is some truth. He is saying that He is the way, that He is the truth and the life. And He was also being very exclusive. Did you pick that up? Because He said no one can come to the Father, how? Except through me. You see, Jesus was not being politically correct. He was not only saying that there is a truth, but that he is the truth. Jesus clearly stood for something. And as we read the Gospels, as we read those biographies, those accounts about Jesus' life, about His ministry, we will find that on more than one occasion, He was not afraid to speak out. He was not afraid to point out things. He was not afraid to be direct with people. There were some things that Jesus clearly identified as being plain wrong, and He was not afraid to state that. On one occasion, He referred to people as you hypocrites, as you sepulchres, whitewashed terms. He was not afraid to be direct. He would not have fitted in very well into a lot of our contemporary society. And without going into any details, just for instance, the whole debate in our society that we had late last year about marriage, we would have known that Jesus would not have fitted in very well, because He was very plain in what He said constituted and who constituted a marriage. So Jesus was not being politically correct, but there was something more here to Jesus than just making strong statements. And that is the fact that he believed in Himself and His cause. So much so that He spent 3.5 years with a group of people around Him and then leaving that with them, with 12 men to carry on his cause. Now, who did he think he was? And more to the point, why did his disciples give their lives for this cause? Why did they commit their total lives to it and even die for this cause? You don't do that unless you believe that you've got something important. Is that true? You don't do that unless you believe you have the truth. You don't do that unless you're convinced that you've got something compelling that needs to be shared. And Jesus had that conviction. In fact, as one person has described it, and it's an interesting phrase. That they say that Jesus had what's called a sanctified arrogance. Because he believed in what he was about, so much so that he committed himself to it and committed to passing it on to his disciples, who in turn caught that conviction, and that's what propelled them and compelled them to share throughout the then known Roman Empire. And subsequently they gave their lives for that cause. You don't do that if you don't convinced that you have the truth. You see, if Jesus had been politically correct, and subsequently those disciples, Christianity would have died out within a few short years and would have been simply a footnote in the annals of history. Our early Adventist pioneers similarly had this conviction. How many of you have watched this DVD? This is something that every person should have in your homes. It's just one way of... This has been one attempt to portray the origins of the Adventist church, the Great Advent movement through the 1800s in the United States, and as those believers went through the whole experience of expecting the world to end, and it didn't, and the little group that came out of that, and the conviction that they had that they had a message that was to be shared to the whole world. That's what propelled them. And as you watch that, the movie there portrays in just a little way the historical facts of how these people such as Joseph Bates, a retired sea captain, James White, prior to that, people like Joshua Himes, who literally sacrificed their health and their wealth to be able to spread the messages that they were discovering from the books of Daniel and Revelation in particular. And back in those days, it was mainly print. Print was the main medium that they used. And it just gives you a bit of an insight in what propelled these people. Why? Because they had this burning conviction that they had discovered a truth that had to be shared to the world. And they did. And they went from place to place using all possible means to share it. And from that small group of people, a movement has now spread right across this world. And many of us part of this movement, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's how it began, with that same conviction. And of course, thinking right here in our own backyard. People like Joseph Steed, who was one of the early Adventists living here in South Australia, just up the road in the hills. He was a literature evangelist, and he would take his push bike and he would take literature and he would cycle. Now get this, he would cycle from here all the way up to Broken Hill with his literature to sell and to offer to people. Why did he do that? Leaving his wife and his children and sacrificing so much? It's because he had this burning conviction that there was a message that he had understood. This message that Jesus was going to come back soon. A message of sharing the Bible truth from Daniel and Revelation again in particular. And this is now written in a children's story, and it's called Peddling the Gospel. They were based in and around the Murray Bridge area. and on the River Murray. And earlier this year, I actually had the opportunity, while I was up at Avondale College, to go to the Avondale Cemetery that's there. And Joseph Steed's grave is there, along with his wife, Julia Steed. And the story is told now in a very nice way in this children's book. This is the second of a series that's being developed by the Ministerial Association at union level. And we will be launching this book. There's a little plug for camp. But we will be launching this book at our big camp, I think, on Thursday evening. And it's based on events that actually happened right here in South Australia. An artist has been employed that's illustrated this book, showing Joseph Steed there with Julia and their family. And I commend that book to you, and particularly for the children, those of you who have grandchildren, this is a great story, and well worth us remembering what it took for these people in the early years to go share the message. If it wasn't for their work, we would probably not be here today. Why did they do it? They did it only because they had this conviction that there was a message that they wanted to get out there. You see, over time, it's natural for us to lose that same conviction. Over time, and we heard about the quote at the beginning, unless organisations are very careful, it is natural for them to drift from their original mission. And when that happens, we lose our fizz. We lose our fizz. When a church becomes politically correct and loses its conviction that it has a unique message and a mission, it has lost its fizz. It's interesting because we see that how that has happened. One of the best examples of that was in the early part of the 20th century with Protestant, what's known as Protestant liberalism. Essentially what took place is amongst a number of mainline Christian denominations, the denominations did away with a number of key biblical teachings, such as the idea of the virgin birth, or belief in miracles, the second coming, the divine inspiration of the Bible, creationism. They did away with what they called these primitive beliefs, pretty much did away with most of those beliefs throughout mainline Christian churches. The result was they plummeted in attendance. So much so that some of the denominations have since then united, such as the Uniting Church. May I add, a little bit to the horror and disappointment and sadness of some of my other colleagues of other denominations. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to interact a little bit with other colleagues, and there are some very godly, I have to say, there are some very godly ministers of other denominations with whom I have had a really good connection with. It was interesting, late last year I was travelling back up to New South Wales, and I was waiting for a connecting flight at the Sydney airport, and it just so happened, in amongst all the people that are just constantly crisscrossing and going from gate to gate, I bumped into the minister of the Presbyterian church in my previous town where I'd been. And we happened to be travelling on the same flight for the next leg of the journey. And I was able to connect up with him. And it was just days out. I remember the date because it was just days out from October 31, which of course last year was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. And so I caught up with Scott, and I got to discuss with him a little bit about what was happening, what his church was intending to do with the Protestant Reformation anniversary. And I remember him sharing his sadness at what he was seeing amongst some of the other churches who were downplaying and doing away with some of the foundations of the Protestant Reformation. Essentially, what he was recognising is they had lost some of their fizz. They had done away with some of those key doctrines and teachings that had led reformers such as Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and John Huss to literally give their lives. And now they're descendants were downplaying it and minimising some of those key teachings. And Scott himself is saddened by it. Sure, we disagree on other areas, Scott and I, but I was able to at least engage with him in a significant conversation about that. And so we come to us. What's our Fizz? What's our Fizz? In short, our Fizz is our unique message and our mission. Our Fizz essentially is derived from seeing, if you notice there in the book of Revelation, especially in the book of Revelation chapter 10, an experience that's described here in Revelation chapter 10. In symbolic form, it's where we find John the Revelator recording in verses 8 onwards, where he hears a voice from heaven saying to me, in Revelation 10, he sees that there's an angel standing holding a book that is open, there at the start of Revelation chapter 10. The angel is holding an open book, an open scroll, an open book. And John then hears in verse 8 a voice that says to him to go up to that angel and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. And I went to the angel and said to him, "Give me the little book." And he said to me, "Take and eat it. It will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth." And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth, but it turned bitter in my stomach. Here is described an interesting experience. A book that is open. What is this book that is open? Interestingly enough, and scholars have recognised that here in Revelation is a reference to a book that is opened. Where else do we find a book that's referred to as open? We find a book that's referred to as being closed for a period of time back in the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 8 and particularly Daniel chapter 12, where at the very end Daniel is told to shut up the book until the time of the end. And then it says, many will run here and fro, and knowledge will be increased. That was simply an idiom, a saying running here and fro is searching, and knowledge, searching the book of Daniel, and knowledge will be increased. For hundreds of years, the book of Daniel was a book that people just didn't really study or understand or bother to read. Until about the 1700s. And here's where it gets interesting. And particularly events such as the French Revolution got some people to start questioning and thinking and becoming a bit aware and saying, things are happening in our world that seem to be a little bit like what the Bible has talked about. Some of the events that perhaps Jesus foretold would happen before the end of the world. And so it led people to go back to the Bible. And it led people to go to the books of Daniel in particular and the books of Revelation. And they started to study it. People across various denominations throughout the 1700s, even people like Isaac Newton. And there was a huge interest in the book of Daniel now suddenly. Daniel chapter 2 and 7 and 8, the prophecies began to be studied across the globe. And of course, from that arose the group of people known as the Millerites, because they had discovered and heard the messages that were being shared from Daniel chapter 8 in particular, a message that was seemingly predicting that Jesus was going to come back and come back soon. And the great Advent awakening that spread throughout the world is really interesting. Right down to even child preachers sharing and preaching the message about the soon return of Jesus in Sweden. Even here in the city of Adelaide, Thomas Playford was one of those preachers who was preaching the nearness of Jesus' second coming in the 1800s. The book of Daniel was open. And then more specifically, as people studied it and as the Millerite movement grew and grew, they got very excited because they came to the idea that Jesus was going to come back in 1844, and many people joined this movement that was growing. And as they learnt and as they expected Jesus to come, boy, it was a sweet experience. And then, of course, what happened? Well, Jesus didn't come back. And that sweet experience turned very bitter. It's a bit hard for us to really encapsulate what it must have been like to have been part of that movement, to have been convinced that Jesus, that in your life, that you would really expect that Jesus would come back. The world would end. And how much harder it must have been to get up on October 23 and October 24 and go amongst your neighbours and your friends and to realise that it's seemingly you were wrong. To be mocked by neighbours and friends, newspaper clippings, cartoons. What had been a really exciting experience had turned really bitter and sour. Just as the prophecy here predicted. And for many people, they gave up and they just went back to what they had done before they even got caught up in the movement, just went back to their old ways. But there was a small group of people who believed that something must have happened, that God must have been in the movement. And so they went back to their Bibles, and here's where it becomes interesting, because they noticed that Revelation chapter 10 doesn't actually finish with verse 10. Did you all notice that as well there? There's another verse here. Verse 11. After he was to eat the book, and it would initially be sweet and then turn bitter, which was fulfilled in those events leading up to 1844 and just after that. Notice what it says then in verse 11. And he said to me, you must prophesy. What's the next word? Again. And those early believers recognised that they still had a work to do. That they weren't wrong that Jesus was going to come back. Sure, he wasn't going to come back then, but he was still going to come back and come back soon. And there were still things that needed to be shared. And as they continued to study their Bible, they rediscovered, notice that what I said, they rediscovered truths that had been either lost or neglected or perhaps not understood fully, such as the seventh-day Sabbath. Such as that we sleep when we pass away, we don't go straight to heaven or hell. Such as that our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit and we are to care for it. Such as that Jesus is now in the heavenly sanctuary. Such as the truths that Jesus is going to come back soon. And these are things that compelled them, and they said, we've got to go out and share this. And so they did. Such as Joseph Steed here in South Australia. That, my friends, is the core mission and the message of our church. That's why we exist. That's why God raised this movement. And we find it located in passages such as Revelation chapter 10. We find particularly in passages such as Revelation chapter 14, verses 6 to 12, better known as what? The three angels' messages, where we find this message. And the significance of this passage, friends, the significance of what we call as the three angels' messages, is that in Revelation chapter 14, you find that this is a message that's shared by the angels, that's depicted by angels sharing, I should say. And then the very next passage describes a harvest scene, which is another description for the second coming of Jesus. In other words, this is the final message. This is an international and an interdenominational message that's to go to the whole world. To every nation, kindred, tongue of people, it says in verse 6. And what's that message? Well, it's multifaceted. It begins with what it says, to preach the everlasting gospel, the good news. The gospel is the good news about Jesus. Call to fear God and give glory to him. A call for people to take God serious, not to fear him, to be sort of scared in the literal sense of fear now, but to take God seriously. What a message that is for an age today where God is really not on people's radars, particularly in our culture, particularly in our country. He's off the nose. To fear God and give glory to him, and to worship him who created the heavens, the earth, the seas, and the living waters, which is very close allusion to the description of the fourth commandment, which calls us to worship him on the Sabbath day and remember him as the creator. There's a judgment message in there. There's a message of warning that Babylon is fallen. There's a message about avoiding the mark of the beast. It's a message with a warning that's to be shared to the whole. That essentially is our Fizz. And when we lose that, when we lose our distinct message, we've lost our reason of existence. How do we lose our fizz? There's a number of ways. And we've managed to find all of those ways. We've managed to find all of the ways to lose our fizz. One way that I would like to suggest to us, there are three main ways that we can lose our fizz. Corporately now speaking. But even though I've spent a lot of time looking at us as talking about our denomination or our movement, you will find that each one of these actually refers to us individually as well. And I've alluded to that at the very beginning. I think if we're all downright honest, we will recognise that personally there is a natural tendency for each of us to lose our fizz individually. Let's be honest, true? And so each of us individually, that can happen. There are three ways I'd like to suggest to us that we can lose our fizz. First one is to forget our roots. Particularly as time goes on, this is a tendency to forget why we exist, why we were raised in the beginning. That's why I'm very thankful and appreciative for these kind of children's story books that are written in such a way to retell our heritage in a significant and meaningful way. When we forget that we are a movement raised with a unique message and mission, we've lost our fizz. Second way we lose our fizz, I've said, is by separating the fizz from the drink. Now you need to follow along with me a little bit closer with this analogy. So let's follow carefully and see if this is going to make sense. Some people just focus on the fizz. For some people, it's so important to concentrate on the fizz. What's our fizz? They just concentrate on our prophecies. They just concentrate on being aware of the end time events, on conspiracies, and what's going to happen. And so we have DVDs produced, books written. You can find YouTube clips that just talk about this all the time, warning about deceptions within Adventism, outside of Adventism, in Christendom, you name it. They're just obsessed with being aware and being concerned about the deception that's there. Their whole focus is on the fizz. What happens when you just focus on the fizz? How good is just fizz on its own, friends? In fact, what is just the fizz? It's just gas, isn't it? One way that we can lose our fizz is by just focusing on the fizz. The other one is just as dangerous. And that is to just say, oh, we don't need the fizz. The main thing is the juice, the sweet water, the sugared water. In other words, we just need to focus on the sweetness, on Jesus himself. We just need to focus on the cross, essentially. That's all we need to do. That's the most important. That's our fizz, people will say. Jesus is our fizz, referring to just the cross. And friends, yes, the cross is important. But you know what? The cross is only half the gospel. Yes, Jesus died for our sins and paid the price on Calvary. But we're still in this sin-sick world. We still have suffering. We still get cancer. We still die, don't we? We're still suffering from that. The story is not over. It hasn't been completed, and it won't be until Jesus comes back and puts an end to sin and sinners forevermore. To talk about just the cross is only half the gospel. And so we lose our fizz in both ways, either by just concentrating on the fizz or by just saying all we need is the sweetness of the drink. But what we actually need, and here's my second main point, is we need the fizz and the drink. In fact, that's not exactly correctly put. It should actually be, we need the fizz in the drink. The fizz in the drink. We need to see our distinctive beliefs, our unique doctrines centered in Jesus Christ himself. Now, it's interesting, we are pendulous by nature as a people, and even though as early Adventists we had this burning conviction, we had a message to share, we started initially well, but what ended up happening is our early pioneers were so obsessed with the Fizz, and they were going around preaching and proving that the seventh day is the Sabbath, and having these debates, and this is a historical fact, that would go from town to town, from city to city, pitch a tent and have a debate, and to prove that the seventh day is the Sabbath. And year after year this was going, and this was the main form of sharing, that eventually Adventists became so renowned as being these great debaters who could prove you wrong. And after a number of years, Ellen White herself said, we've been preaching the law, the law, the law, until we become as dry as the hills of Gilboa. And guess what God did? He sent 2 young men along to remind us that we had so much spent time on the Fizz that we'd forgotten that the Fizz needs to be in the drink, centred in the sweetness of Jesus Christ. And so came the 1888 message to remind us that it needs to be centred in Him. That's what happens when you just concentrate on the Fizz. You lose that it needs to have Jesus at the very heart of it. No wonder she made the statement that she said, of all Christians, Seventh-day Adventists should be foremost in uplifting Christ. She went on to say that at the heart of every one of our doctrines, the cross of Christ needs to be seen. That hasn't always been the case, we have to be honest. And it still happens today. Because even to this very day, you'll have those who say, we need to preserve the Fizz. And there'll be others who say, no, not really the Fizz. We're embarrassed about the Fizz. Let's just have the sugary water of Jesus only. But it has to be the Fizz in the drink, friends, lest we lose that significance. The third and final way I want us to understand how we can lose our Fizz is, that looks pretty nice there at the moment. If we came back next week, it could still be there. If we came back here next month, it could still be there in the bottle. If we came this time next year to that bottle, it would still be there. What good is it sitting in a bottle? What will it taste like in a year's time? Even within the bottle, it'll start to lose its Fizz, wouldn't it, over time? Any company knows that their business is not to fill bottles just in the drink. They want it to get it out of the bottles into people's glasses, into people's mouths. The drink is meant to be drunk, to state the very obvious. True? That's the purpose of the drink. Now, if our Fizz, if we recognise that us and our mission, our message is our Fizz, then our aim needs to be that we're to get it out of our bottles. Which is what? Out of us being just gathered together. We like to gather together with those that think and the same as us. But Jesus didn't say for us to go and gather together and just hold meetings. In fact, He said, go and make disciples of all nations. He said, you are the salt of the earth. If the salt loses its saltiness, it's another way of saying of losing your Fizz. But for salt to be effective, it has to get out of the shaker and be mixed in the food. And here's the challenge that I see is very much for each of us. We need to get out of our bottle. What if we really did that? What if we really did church that way? What if we structured ourselves to be very intentional about that? Let me just challenge us this morning very, very briefly with that. What would that look like? Individually, I would see it happening as us being intentional about mixing amongst community groups, organisations, to be seen and to be amongst clubs and groups individually. What would that look like, perhaps more corporately? I think we would stop running things just for the sake of running them and for running them for ourselves. We run so many events, we run so many programs, but so much of it is to feed us. And I've been guilty of it, I'll confess. I'm speaking openly and including myself in it. What if our Pathfinder clubs, for instance, we're intentional about having it a place where young people can come who don't know Jesus? What if our Adventurers Club is not just for our church member children? What if the Road Trippers group, and I don't know what that group totally consists of here, was not just a social gathering of church members, but was an intentional way of seeing to invite your neighbours and your friends along? What if our Sabbath schools were not just for the purpose of studying the lesson and getting through to Fridays before the second bell goes, but what if it was intentional about saying, hey, is there someone that we can invite? Is there someone new here? What if we spent time intentionally praying for our neighbours and our friends before we launched into the lesson, or perhaps at the end of the lesson? What if we even looked around within our congregation and saw people that are perhaps lonely and slip away and don't get invited to join a group, even as simple as that? What if our small groups were those where we didn't just gather together to study topics that are common to us, but when we got together, we looked at ways in which we can invite new people to join? We need to get out of our bottle. We need to share the Fizz that we have, because that's what it was intended. I want to challenge us. First of all, how's your Fizz? And secondly, how are you going about sharing it? You see, at the heart of our Fizz is remembering who we are and what our message is. If we don't have a Fizz, we've got nothing unique to offer. We've gone flat. So I want to challenge us. Where are you at with this? I want us to think about the words of this closing hymn. Perhaps if we can have it up on the screen. If you look at the chorus, if we just flick onto the chorus, it says, "Hail him, the King of glory, once the Lamb for sinners slain. Tell the wondrous story, Jesus comes to reign." You'll see in those words that it connects both the Lamb for sinners slain and the fact that Jesus is coming again. You have here both the cross of Christ at Christ's first coming, and you have the cloud portraying Jesus' second coming. We need both together, both in our message and in our mission. With the first half, we only have half the gospel. The second half is only possible because of the first half. Jesus is both the Lamb that was slain and the King that's coming to reign. That essentially is at the heart of our message and our mission. And I pray that each of us individually will recognise this, and then corporately to say, how can we be intentional about everything that we do so that it's focused in sharing this and tasted by others.